I'm going to hold this because I feel like I'm a little small and I get lost behind that. I do have to make one correction, which is totally my fault, that we didn't update the bio. The book is coming out October 2023. A lot of that has to do with the pandemic. Honestly, most things are published and printed overseas. And so I recently heard of a colleague who had their book release delayed by a year because her books were still in the port of LA. On a boat somewhere. So that isn't quite my situation, but they're just giving it a longer lead time. But I'm really, really excited about that book. If you do like this talk tonight, you will also like the talk that I have coming up. Okay, great. If you like my talk tonight, you'll like my book, 8 Flavors, you'll like Endangered Eating. However, there is no murder in either of those books. I research a lot of topics. Actually, backstage, Joe was asking me how I come to these topics. And oftentimes, it's just something I stumble across that I'm interested in, but can't find one really good body of research dedicated to it. So rather than taking the many years and all the work of writing a book, sometimes I just research it and put together a talk just for fun, just because I want to. And that's a little bit what happened here, but it does sort of correspond with a project that I've been sort of working on in the back of my mind for a number of years. So let me just say this, that if you think the movement of people who love true crime is something new, you'd absolutely be wrong. I mean, I'm sure you've heard the term yellow journalism, a term that dates from the 19th century, and this style of journalism lasts at least through the early 20th century, and it is this really scintillating, wicked, all the gory details. There were papers like this that you could buy for a penny. In fact, in England, they were often called penny dreadfuls, that were just like crime blotters, that were probably only maybe 50% true. Journalism back then wasn't quite what it is today. Even with a lot of the criticism of journalism we have currently, it is nothing like it was in the 19th century. So I kind of had this idea in the back of my mind that there was this sort of love of gore and the unusual, this sort of out of ordinary crimes in the 19th century, not just here in America, but across the world. And then I happened to be gifted this handwritten recipe book. It was written by a husband and wife from about 1870 to 1911. And I know exactly when this husband and wife stopped writing in this book, because the person who gave it to me, a close friend, said that I didn't mean to laugh at that, it's just such a bizarre thing to say. The couple who wrote this book were murdered in 1910 by their son-in-law. It is a complicated and really fascinating story, and a lot of interesting things reflected in the book, including the fact that the husband wrote a lot of recipes for medicines, this being the end of the 19th century, a lot of them which included ingredients like morphine and cocaine. So some of the poisons that were being used in these crimes at this time were also being used as medicines at this time as well. So one of the things that, there were so many strange twists and turns in this story, and I will say I did propose it as a book, couldn't find a publisher for it, so I think someday this is just a weird thing I would have to do by myself because I can't get it out of my head. I always have a motto of I'm not gonna wait to ask for someone's permission to do what I wanna do. I'm just gonna go do it. So as I'm researching this, the son-in-law is arrested. This happens in Ohio, where I'm from. He's put into jail, and allegedly, again, we're talking about not great journalism, he gets in trouble for writing love letters to a female murderer who is also being held in the jail. Her name is Catherine Mann, or Mance, or Mans. It's spelled a million different ways. I don't believe the love letter thing, but she was a real person, and she was arrested and jailed for the poisoning of her sister with strychnine, I believe, by putting strychnine in her hot chocolate. Oh, it's not gonna get better, so I hope, well, luckily we were very, very clear with the title of the talk. But of course, when they told me to come to Florida and give this talk, I was like, okay, whatever they want. So the story does seem to be true. I don't know a lot about what happens to her, but it just sort of clicked in my head that not only was the 19th century obsessed with true crime, they were obsessed with female murderers. And when women murder, they tend to poison. So let me throw out a couple statistics at you too. What is my next slide? Okay, now we're gonna get back to her. So there was a study done between 1875 and 1880, and it was found that about 7 out of every 10 poisonings were performed by women. Now that number has dropped, so Jen, so you can breathe a little easier tonight. Only 4 out of 10 poisonings are by women nowadays. But it is still a disproportionate number when you consider that women represent only about 21%, or 2 out of 10 arson cases, and only 7.9% of gun murders. When women murder, they tend to poison. Now, why is that? Now, poisoning is interesting because it is premeditated. It's not something that can be done in a flash. You've got to think about it and you have to plan it. And often it's a tool that women use because they are in the role of caregiver. They're preparing meals. They have jobs like nurses, governesses. They have access to the food and drink and toiletries of the person who is their victim. But especially historically, this has to do with a power play. When we look at the statistics, actually even today, the poisoner tends to be 5 to 10 years younger than the victim. So we're not only talking about, for the most part, I saw someone who looked relieved. So we're talking about what is the word I want? There's someone who is powerless in a relationship, whether that's a professional, familial, or marriage relationship, and they're using a non-confrontational weapon to end that relationship. Now, here's something that I think is really gonna make you breathe a sigh of relief. The big reason those poisonings have dropped is divorce. In fact, one of the cases we're going to talk about tonight has been credited with legalizing divorce in France in the mid-19th century, and that is one of the things that sort of led to the legalization of divorce around the Western world. So I often hear people lament the idea of, oh, divorces are up, half of all marriages dissolve. Well, people aren't murdering each other as much. So it's like a little bit of a give and take. If women have legal access to not just the ability to divorce, but things like their own independence, their own checking accounts, their own credit cards, the ability to put loans in their name, all these things which really for the most part we've only gained since the 1970s in your generation, so thank you for the work that you've done. All of these things mean that women are trapped in difficult situations a lot less because we have more independence, autonomy, and ability to escape. So that is something to keep in mind when we look at historical murders. However, not the cases tonight, really. Because if you're going to talk about murder publicly, they have to be something that, in a way, the Victorians would enjoy. Something a little scintillating, a little bizarre, right? A little shocking. And part of the obsession, I mean, obviously, one more statistic, this is true of the past and today. Let's be clear. When murders happen, it's men doing the murdering. 90% of murders are committed by men. So all these poisonings we're so worried about, that's only 10% of all the murders that are out there. So husbands, you can laugh and be scared all you want, now that I'm giving your wives some tips. But when it comes down to it, it's actually men that are responsible for the violence in this country. That is, in a way, why we're infatuated when women do this act, right? I think we still see it to this day, right? And in the 19th century, there were really sort of two, avatars of women, how they were portrayed in the press. One, and I think these, in my mind, are like the two sides of sort of, God, what America wants from pop culture in a lot of ways. On one hand, there is the woman, especially in tateless Victorian society, that this transgression kind of makes her sexy. She's dangerous, she's the Black Widow. There's that side of it. And on the other side, often the much more commonly portrayed side in the 19th century is this fallen woman. Because we were shown as in charge of the domestic sphere, and we were the morally superior of the two, and we were there to take care of the children. So to have a woman who has fallen from that role, it's almost this she's portrayed like this fallen angel, like the devil made a deal with her and she's to be pitied. So those are the two ways that women in these situations are often talked about. So tonight I'm going to talk about 3 different cases, and I just noticed that I don't have anywhere to see the time. So if you want to give me maybe a 20, 15s kind of, yeah, thank you. Maybe you want to hear more, but I also want to keep you all night. So the earliest case I'm going to talk about is from America. The second one is going to be early 19th century France, and the third one's going to be late 19th century in England. And they all are all kind of about these aggrieved lovers. I loved that term from the introduction, that in this case, these three things are about relationships. So Sarah Clark, this case is from 1799, and it takes place in Cumberland County in Pennsylvania. Spoiler alert, are some of you from Pennsylvania? Yeah. This was one of the earliest, if not the earliest, hanging of a woman in Pennsylvania. Spoiler alert, she dies at the end. And one of the earliest hangings in America itself. So this is 1799. And the story goes, some of which I believe, some of which I don't, because we're relying on historical records, that she was a live-in servant, which was very common for teenage girls, in the house of the Douglases, excuse me. And Sarah Clark, so they all have names that kind of sound the same, just very, very British. Sarah Clark was quite infatuated with the son of Mr. Douglas. His name is not documented, he's just referred to as the young Douglas. But the young Douglas likes another woman, Anne Carruthers. I mean, they're like 14, 15, 16, so this is like pretty normal stuff. However, Sarah Clark has an idea. She decides to leave her job in the Douglases' household, and she takes a job as a live-in maid in the Carruthers' household. Yeah, we already know where this is going. So in her mind, if she can off Anne Carruthers, then the young Douglas will be hers. So, and this is one of the strangest lines from the historical documents, having no ill will against the family, she desired to poison only Anne. Oh. Well, that's kind. So she's waiting for an opportunity. She's going to do the poisoning with arsenic. We're going to get into like defining some of these poisons a little bit later too. And arsenic, though I will say now, is an odorless, tasteless white powder that you can pretty easily dissolve in liquids. She doesn't find an opportunity, and in an act of desperation, she dumps it into the family's leaven. If any of you have made a sourdough starter, that's leaven. They didn't have packets of dry active yeast. You had to have wet yeast hanging out in your house all the time, and so she dumps, which must have been a considerable amount of arsenic, into the leaven. The family bakes the bread. Arsenic does hold up under heat, and so the entire family is poisoned from eating this bread. Now, ironically, everyone dies but Anne. And Sarah Clark is convicted on the pretty obvious evidence, and she is hung in 1799. All right, so that's our short one. Now we're going to get a little bit more complicated with the story of Marie Cabell, or as she will become to known, Marie Lafarge. Now this is a story of upper class tragedies. So this is another level is why people were fascinated with it. And there are many, many, many images of Marie as well. She was sort of an international sensation. I will say I've got a great source if you want to read more for the last story I'm going to see, or if you just want to read more in general, there's a site called Murderpedia. I'm not even making that up. But unfortunately, the books about Marie Cabell are all in French, at least so far. But she also did write her own memoir too, which I think has been translated at this point. So if you want to get her side of the story, it's available on Google Books. So Marie has a little bit of a tragic past, as this and the next figure do. Her dad dies in a hunting accident at the age of 12. I should say that she's born in 1817 outside of Paris. Her mother does remarry, but her mom also passes away a few years later. So at the age of 18, she is adopted by an aunt and uncle. Now, I know what you're thinking. She's 18 years old. She's a full adult. Why does she need to be adopted? Well, this is the 19th century. And remember how I just mentioned that most of the rights that women have today we got in the 1970s? So in the 19th century, you are your father's property, and then you are your husband's property as a woman. So if you are now orphaned, and she would have been considered an orphan when she lost her father, not when she lost her mother. If you are an orphan, you've got to have some kind of family. So I should mention that she's allegedly descended from multiple French kings. So she comes from a very wealthy upper class family. Her aunt and uncle are wealthy and upper class as well, and they give her kind of a good education, kind of a good dowry, but just enough so there's this little passive aggressive barb of like, you're not actually our family. So by the age of 23, she is unmarried, which is unusual for her status and in this place and this time. And so her uncle decides to get a marriage broker, basically a rich French yenta, to find her a husband, okay? And this rich French yenta finds a man named Charles Lafarge. Now, Charles Lafarge, his family was wealthy at one time until his dad, also in the 18-teens, bought a defunct monastery and tried to turn it into a foundry to make it a profitable business, and the business failed and they went bankrupt. So at this point, the only thing the Lafarges think they can do is marry Charles, the son, to a wealthy family. So what the uncle wanted for Marie was a man who didn't just make money from having a job, that he had a large family fortune. Charles Lafarge went to the same marriage broker and was like, yes, I have this many hundreds of thousands of francs in my estate, and I make this many hundreds of thousands of francs as a barrister. And they were like, great. The uncle didn't want Marie to know that he had employed a marriage broker, and so he just arranged an accidental meeting at an opera. Marie hated him. She called him boorish, I believe, and some other very 19th century insult word. And then if I can find it for you quickly, I will read it to you. Yeah, she hated him. That's the short story of it. Basically, the uncle said, this is my friend. He has a palatial estate in the country. She really doesn't like him, but she decides to get married because she doesn't think she's going to have many other options. Now, they go to the country estate, which is actually what is pictured there. Oh wait, we'll come back to that, spoiler alert. And it is in shambles. Now this is pretty much the plot of, I think, multiple movies I've seen, where the new bride goes to the country estate and it's falling down. His father is dead, but his mother-in-law lives there, and of course she hates him, story as old as time. She's absolutely miserable. She locks herself in her room. She asks for an annulment of the marriage. And basically, and I'm just gonna put this in modern terms, he doesn't say that he will annul the marriage, but he promises he won't have sex with her until the house is fixed up. Which again, great. Now maybe you're beginning to understand why women poisoned men. So, Marie is trying to make the best of her situation. She begins to try to warm up to her mother-in-law. She begins to work on the household. And she writes her new husband, Charles, letters of recommendation to go into Paris and find investors to bring back the foundry business. And she begins writing him love letters and telling all of her friends everything is wonderful. She's so in love. And on Christmas Day, she sends him a box with a cake and says, I baked you a Christmas cake. On midnight on Christmas Day, I want you to eat a piece of the cake and I'll eat a piece of the cake, and we'll have this sort of moment together even though we are far apart. So we already know what's wrong with the cake. Charles takes a bite of the cake. He feels almost immediately ill. By the next day, he has what's described as cholera-like symptoms, nausea, diarrhea, weakness. Cholera was definitely a killer in the 19th century because, of course, we didn't have antibiotics that are used to treat it today. But also, we also really didn't understand the importance of rehydrating if you were vomiting or having diarrhea. So you get things like muscle cramps, and then you can eventually die from dehydration. So it's pretty serious, but at the same time, pretty common. So he throws the cake out because he thinks the cake's gone bad. Again, pretty common at a time before a lot of preservatives and refrigeration. But a week later, when he heads back to the country estate, he's still not feeling well, and Marie says, don't worry, I'm gonna take care of you. So they have a live-in servant named Anne Brun at the palatial estate, because even though, you know, he's a former, I don't know, in the 19th century, they just always have servants. It was just much cheaper, and it doesn't matter if you didn't have any money, you still have to keep up appearances. So Anne Brun is there, and a lot of what we know next comes from her. She says that Marie puts her husband to bed, she feeds him meats and soups and eggnogs, which are not quite the eggnog today. It's usually like milk plus a shaken egg plus some sugar, a little nutmeg, a restorative drink. And she sees Anne stirring into this eggnog a white powder from a special box. And she says, what is that, Marie? And Marie says, it's orange blossom sugar. Yeah, Anne says, as well, because as soon as Charles has a sip of this eggnog, he starts getting sick again. So it seems likely, at least to Anne, that what is going in this beverage is arsenic. So arsenic was a very common poison in the 19th century. It actually came to Europe in the late 17th century. Nope, I take that back, that's stripped now, I'm gonna get to that. Arsenic is quite a bit older, it's an element. But when we talk about poisonous arsenic, we're talking about arsenic trioxide. And the arsenic trioxide molecule is poisonous, it's a chemical compound. As I mentioned already, it is a white powder, but it actually creates this really beautiful green dye too. So in the 19th century, the same time that Marie could go to a pharmacist and buy arsenic to kill rats, which is what she said it was for, arsenic was also available in a ton of commercial products. And arsenic was an extremely fashionable color of green. This painting, called The Green Room, is from the 1820s, and everything in that room is dyed with arsenic, from the wallpaper to her dress. The worst killers were, arsenic was a popular color for silk ball gowns. So of course you go to the ball, you're dancing, 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 you're sweating, and that allows the arsenic dye to actually enter into your pores. So women were literally killing themselves for fashion with this arsenic green color. I even saw recently at the Antiquarian Society, which is in Massachusetts, they had to get an arsenic test to test the covers of their green books because they used to dye books arsenic green. And so they had to go through and pull all of their arsenic books. There were about a dozen of them, and put them into a special collection with special warnings on them. Because one of the things that arsenic does is it constricts blood vessels. So you would carry around arsenic trioxide tablets to dissolve into water and splash on your face, because it would dissolve the blood vessels in your face and give you a beautiful white snowy complexion. So whereas someone might notice if you were buying arsenic in the store today, and as a matter of fact, arsenic is still used as a poison, as like a rat killer, but you have to put, when you manufacture it, you have to put like not only a green dye, but other compounds that make it seem very, very greasy looking if you put it into a drink, so that it's very, very obvious if you're trying to poison somebody with it. But in the 19th century, it's a dye, it's your face wash, it is everywhere. So it's very, very easy for Marie de Lafarge to get her hands on it. As I mentioned, odorless, tasteless, works particularly well in hot drinks because when you boil it, it dissolves completely and you can't see it in the liquid, and still works. So, unsurprisingly, Charles Lafarge dies. Anne takes, oh, he wasn't that great a guy. I'm sorry, you guys were like, oh, he lied to her. Should he have been murdered? No, but no, I'm not on Marie's side either. Anne goes to the family first and says, here's what I saw. The family goes to the police and investigators brought in, despite the fact that, all right, to be fair, we don't actually know this is what happened. Okay, we kind of do. So 2 doctors were brought in and they both said this is cholera. But in a slightly different time, Marie might have gotten away from it. This is 1840 when Charles dies. And this trial is really well known because it's the first use of toxicology in a criminal trial. It's also the first trial that was reported on every single day in the newspaper. So that was happening as early as 1840. But in this trial, a new test was performed called the Marsh test. And the Marsh test was a test that could take a liquid, in this case the remains of one of the poison eggnogs, expose it to a sulfur gas, and then the resulting steam, if there was arsenic in the liquid, would leave a metallic sheen on the inside of the boiling beaker. No, I haven't done it. No, I don't know exactly how it works. And actually there's a different but similar test that is still used to this day. But they could use toxicological evidence to see if the eggnog was poisoned with arsenic, and according to the Marsh test, it had arsenic in it. So in 1840, Marie Lafarge is convicted. She is sent to prison. She is very much the sort of fallen angel depiction. I know, so there's like you can Google her, there's dozens of drawings of her from the time, looking wounded and beautiful. And as I mentioned already, she writes her memoirs, which are available on Google Books too, about what happened and the lies, that she felt trapped, that she felt abused. Of course, we don't know how much is true, and nobody should be murdering anybody, but she is actually pardoned after her memoirs come out. About 12 years later, she is given a pardon. Unfortunately, at that point, and part of the reason she got pardoned is that she contracted tuberculosis, and she dies about 5 or 6 months later. Do I think Marie did it? Yeah, I do. I do think she poisoned her husband. But at the same time, this happened so long ago that even despite the Marsh test, there's not necessarily conclusive evidence for her doing this. So I'll let you make up your own mind. Now there's more Marie. So many pictures of her. She really was a celebrity. And again, you could follow this case in the newspapers, not just in France, but even over here in America too. So one of the wildest cases we're going to talk about tonight is, and the final, is Christina Edmonds. Okay, strap in. So Christina Edmonds is born in 1828. She originally grows up between London and Canterbury, so we're going over to England now. She will become known as the chocolate cream killer. And if you are interested in learning more about her story than I can get through tonight, there is a great book by the same name that goes into detail of the case as well. Lots of original sources and research in there. So Christina Edmonds, the chocolate cream killer, I should mention, so a chocolate cream is not necessarily chocolate inside. It is a type of candy which you can still find in your Whitman samplers of a whipped sugar filling with chocolate around the outside. And it can be vanilla, it can be cocoa flavored, but it can be like raspberry flavored too. So that's what you're looking at. We'll look at some of them later. So she has a very tragic childhood, let's put it this way. So she's the oldest of 3 siblings. She has a younger sister and then a youngest brother. Her father is actually a very prominent architect, and the family becomes quite wealthy based on his occupation. So they weren't lords, they weren't born into money. He's really good at his job, he becomes really well known for it. And then as Christina reaches like her teenage years, her father is in and out of the hospital. Sometimes it's physical maladies like paralysis on half of his body. Sometimes it's because he suddenly has an explosive temper or is confused and doesn't know where he is. And by the time Christina, or Christiana, sometimes it's spelled, is 17, her father is institutionalized in an insane asylum, and that is where he will live out the rest of her days, dying where Christiana is 19. So looking at this historically, it's of course difficult to know exactly what's going on. Scholars basically have 2 theories about what happened to Christiana's father and then her family. One is that her father was schizophrenic. Schizophrenia is a very severe mental illness that usually shows up by the time you're a teenager, but can come on later in life. So he went from being very put together, a really renowned architect, to really going insane and terrorizing his family. The other theory and that of course can be hereditary within families as well. The other theory, one that might be more plausible, is this, that sometime as a young man, the father contracted syphilis. Now, luckily, syphilis isn't so scary anymore because it's very easily treated with penicillin. It is an STI that is only contagious for a very, very short amount of time, about 3 to 6 weeks, but then the infection stays in your body for the rest of your life if it's untreated. And again, in the 1820s and 30s, there was no way to treat syphilis. Now, the long-term effects of syphilis, and I'm talking like 10 to 30 years in the future, are things like convulsions, paralysis, gangrenous symptoms, particularly in the face, and eventually insanity. I think probably the most famous person we all know that had sort of long-term syphilis is Al Capone. He's known for sort of losing his mind at the end of his life. And actually, that only happens in about 10% of people who have like lifelong cases of syphilis. However, if you give it to your partner, in this case, Christiana's mother, and then the mother has children, you can have what's called congenital syphilis. And that is syphilis that is inherited by the child, which again usually begins to show up as they get into their like preteen years. So the reason why this might be a more plausible theory is because both of Christiana's siblings die by the time they're in their early 30s with no real explanation and follow the same path as their father. They begin having physical and then mental maladies, are institutionalized, and then die in the institution. Unsurprisingly, by the 1860s, it's only Christiana and her mom left. Christiana is approaching 30, she is not married. In fact, this sort of repeated tragedies bring her mom and her closer together. There's sort of the support, they really rely on each other, and they luckily do have enough money from her father's successful career that they don't really have to worry about it. So after her sister dies, when Christiana is 39, and this happens in early 1870s. Yes, early 1870s, the family moves to Brighton, which is a seaside town. It's kind of a resort town, but certainly there were people who lived there year-round as well. And they move into a home, basically an elderly couple rents out a floor to them. They become really, really good friends. And Christiana is having some sort of nerve difficulties that's diagnosed as neuralgia, and which is basically like, it's related to fibromyalgia today. So it's like kind of pain in your nerves. And she's referred to a local doctor by the name of Mr. Beard. Now, Mr. Beard is a married man, and he's a little bit younger than Christiana too, who's approaching 40. But the perspective at the time says that Christiana was driven to the brinks of insanity and desperation because at nearly 40 years old, she was unmarried. Now I'm 41. They don't have a husband, so you better look out. But this was the attitude at the time, right? That you were a spinster, that this was a failing, that this was, in some sense, you were going against your role on this planet as a woman if you didn't get married and have children of your own. So she did have these societal pressures. Now, for one reason or another, Christiana and Dr. Beard take up with each other. There are letters, love letters written back and forth, half written in Italian. They're sort of obnoxious to read, but like, later on, Dr. Beard says that they did not have a physical relationship, but scholars looking back in this don't necessarily believe this. We can say that at best, he did not discourage the flirtation with Christiana. They saw each other multiple times a week. They wrote multiple times a day. Christiana began working in the office. She began copying medical drawings to be hung up in the office. And then she actually develops a friendship with Mrs. Beard as well. The whole family does. They would often visit together. The Beards had 3 young children, and one day Christiana stops by with a box of chocolate creams. And she says, "These are for you and the children. Give one a try." And she pops one of the chocolate creams into Mrs. Beard's mouth. Mrs. Beard says she bites down on it. It tastes strange. She excuses herself, goes around the corner, spits it out. Christiana makes her excuses and leaves, and that night Mrs. Beard falls ill. Don't worry, she lives. Here's the whole fam. She lives, but her husband, who was out of town, when he comes home, Mrs. Beard tells him what happened and thinks it's strange, and she doesn't have any reason to think why Christiana would try anything, but Dr. Beard does. And he immediately cuts off all contact with Christiana. Now, the truth will eventually come out that Christiana thought in her mind, whether she was told this or whether it was something that she created herself, that all she needed to do was get rid of the wife, right? Tale as old a time. And then she and the doctor would be together. Now, here's where things get really twisted. So Christiana is absolutely devastated by the fact that Dr. Beard will no longer talk to her, is not responding to her letters, won't come and see her. And this is when she really starts becoming obsessed with him, thinking about him, talking about him, asking about him constantly. And in her mind, the only thing she can do is prove to the doctor she is innocent. So she begins buying bags of chocolate creams from Maynard's, which, you know, I meant to look before I came here if it's still there, but at least in the 1870s, this is a famous chocolatier in Brighton Beach, who they made some of their candies in store, but they had certain styles of candies that were bought from other places, in particular the French-style chocolate creams. Now, how did the French style differentiate from the other ones? Couldn't find out. Maybe they were just the same, but had a fancier name and a higher price. But the most important thing here is that they weren't made in the shop, they came from a distributor. She will buy a bag of chocolate creams, and in round 1, she injects them with strychnine and will leave them places. Leave them at the counter at the hardware store, and in fact, in several incidences, she's caught talking to like newsboys and asking if they like chocolate and giving them a bag of chocolates. The kids, of course, eat the chocolates. Many of them fall ill for days upon a time and then recover. In the next round, she starts giving kids money to buy chocolates from Maynard's, which she takes home, injects with strychnine, and then returns saying they were the wrong type of chocolate cream. And then it's the 19th century, and they didn't have rules against this kind of thing. They just restocked the chocolates. So already there were these mysterious illnesses happening in Brighton, and now people are going to the store, getting a mixed bag of chocolate creams, and in there are ones poisoned with strychnine. And this is when the unfortunate really does happen, that an uncle buys some for his nephew at a family party. He gives the chocolates to his nephew. The very small child, maybe 3 years old, immediately takes ill, and in less than 24 hours is dead. There is an inquest into this, which in sort of early law, basically that's where it's not a trial, it's when detectives or the city begin to interview different witnesses to decide if there is something or someone to prosecute. Because she says she herself had been poisoned by candies from Maynard's, and that she was concerned and that she had gone to complain to Maynard's to say, I think there's something wrong with your chocolates. And if someone had only listened to her, this child would have been spared. Of course, in the meantime, she's writing Dr. Beard saying, it couldn't possibly be me, I can't stand it, you think of me this way, look, the poisonings are happening all over town, I can't be to blame, and he, very smart at this point, no longer talks to her. So because he's still not talking to her, where are we in these slides? Chocolate creams. Okay, so let's talk about what strychnine is. Strychnine is a little bit of a more modern poison than arsenic. Arsenic's quite old. Strychnine is from this plant, the Strychnos nux vomica plant, which comes into Europe in the late 17th century. The poison comes from the seeds, a little bit like cyanide, which comes from, bitter almonds, but all fruit, all drupes essentially, that's a fruit with a pit in the middle, have a little bit of cyanide in it. That's why you're not supposed to eat apple seeds. That's why you shouldn't eat peach pits, cherry pits, and if you come across an almond tree in the woods, leave it be, because it could be the bitter almonds, not the sweet almonds, and it takes about 8 bitter almonds to kill you. Not a lot. Interestingly, to get almond flavoring, it actually comes from bitter almonds. That's why people would eat it historically, because it smells really good to humans. We really like the way that it tastes too. But basically the poison is created when like an almond is smashed. It's a defense mechanism on the part of the plant to protect its seeds. So it's different parts of different cells in the almond and different parts of the seed coming together, creating a poisonous chemical compound that very quickly sort of dissipates. So today, almonds are mashed and then they're sort of washed with water, which washes away the cyanide, and then the flavor and distillate is made from that. So this is why you shouldn't eat random almonds. So Strychnos nux vomica is a little bit the same. The strychnine is distilled from the pits of these little orange fruits. It was really common in rat poison at the time. So again, it was something that was very easy to buy. But in the 1860s, there was a law passed in England, and pretty shortly after in the United States, that if you bought arsenic or strychnine, you had to sign your name in a book. And you also had to have someone vouch for you too. So there was a recognition that people were being poisoned with these things, and they shouldn't be quite so easy to get. Additionally though, strychnine, it has an alkaloid in it that's very similar in composition to caffeine. So yeah, you had to sign your name in the book when you were getting rat poison, but strychnine was available as like a study aid. There were pills that you could take that were low doses of strychnine, because since it acted on the body like caffeine, it would wake you up and you could study more. So you get enough of those pills, I mean, it's probably not surprising that there were deaths from overdose from strychnine tonics and pills, particularly among students as well. So it's another thing that was just sort of, we'll come back to that, available out there that was really easy to get. Okay, so here's what happens to Christiana. When round 1 of poisonings don't work to change the doctor's mind, she goes in for round 2. She makes gift baskets with cakes, tartlets, fruits, sends them all around the town. There's another round of poisonings, nobody dies. She reaches out to the police because she says she received one of these gift baskets too. But finally, the detectives working in this case have wised up. They've requested all the poison books from their local pharmacies. And they get the one for the pharmacy where Christiana gets her medicine for her neuralgia, which, by the way, was often treated with strychnine. So she might have not have even bought rat poisoning. She might have just been in there getting her own medicine, but she still had to sign for it. And so all of the gift baskets came with little notes, and the police compared the handwriting of those notes with the handwriting in the book, which, by the way, today is not a perfect science and can or cannot be documented, but she definitely did this, and they come to arrest Christiana. She goes on trial. She's convicted in 1877. At this point, she's fully admitting what she's done, but as her lawyers and several doctors noticed, she understood that poisoning someone with strychnine was wrong, but she also had no idea of the moral consequences. It was very much like, well, I did it because I needed to do this, because I needed the doctor to love me. So although she's initially convicted and sent to prison, pretty soon after her sentence is commuted, and she is charged with insanity. She is sent to the Broadmoor Asylum for the Criminally Insane, which still exists outside of London and is still in use. And this is where she lives the rest of her days. She lives until the age of 89 when she finally passes away. And then there's one other strange ending to this. 15 years after this whole incident, Dr. Beard is committed to an asylum. He has had increasingly paranoid thoughts. He believes that there are people out to get him. And he also lives a very long life in an asylum until the age of 86, but he spends more than half of his life in an insane asylum where he dies. Weird stuff, right? So I talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but I think that to this day, a lot of our fascination is that thinking of women poisoning their husbands, or in the worst case, their entire families, it goes against our idea of the ideal woman, that we're supposed to be the caretakers, and that we're supposed to put everybody around us above ourselves. We come last. We have much more recognition of the issues that led to these issues in the 19th century, but certainly we're not totally free of them. And again, I am not defending these women. Nobody should be murdering anybody. However, the fact that we have more freedom and independence means not only are we doing a lot less murdering, you're welcome, but also there is a lot less domestic violence between couples. We can choose our own lives. So in an era when we're beginning to roll back some of those freedoms that made some of these women feel very, very trapped, it's an important thing to consider, men. And that are historical female poisoners. Thank you.